Happy New Year! For my first video of 2026, I asked my followers, is there anything about English tenses that confuses you? Tell me about it and I'll tell you how to use English tenses correctly in those situations. And I got some really interesting replies. I got people asking me to teach about passive infinitives, passive gerunds, passives with modals, passives with participles, using the historical present simple, the historical present continuous, using not for inversions, and textual analysis, where someone sent me a text and asked me to check if they were using tenses correctly. Let's start with passive infinitives. Now, some of you are probably thinking, what is a passive infinitive? So let me walk you through an example, two examples to show you what this means. Now, imagine that you are in front of a crowd of people like this, and you start by telling them, I want to tell you a story. We use I want to tell you a story because this is what I want. The subject is going to do the action of telling. Now compare that to the next example, where a child tells their father, I want to be told a story. Here, the child is I, but the child is not telling the story this time. The child wants to receive the story. They want someone else to tell the story. So in the first example, I is the actor, the person telling the story. And in the second one, I is the receiver, the person who hears the story, who receives the story. Now, notice in the second example, I want to be told a story. And this is a passive infinitive. The passive infinitive is where we have to followed by be in its infinitive form and then the past participle. So why did we use the passive infinitive instead of ordinary passive form? Because ordinary passive form, we change the verb to be for tense. I was told a story, I am told a story. But why here is it to be told a story? Let's explore this. Well, first of all, we use passive infinitives with modals. So if this lady started by saying, I must tell you the reason for the story that I'm going to tell, that's her saying it. But if we make that passive with must, where now the emphasis is on the receivers, then the lady may say, you must be told the reason. You must receive the reason. You must receive the story. But because we have must, the modal verb, in front of the passive form, modals are followed by infinitives. So be stays in the infinitive form here. You must be told the reason. We also use passive infinitives when we have a verb followed by to plus infinitive in the active voice, where the infinitive contains the real action. So consider the two examples here. I expect to tell you tomorrow. I expect to be told tomorrow. Notice that the real action here is the telling. The real action comes in the to plus infinitive part. Expect is not an action. Tell is the action. So in English, sometimes we have two verbs together. We have a verb that then is followed by to plus infinitive. But if to plus infinitive contains the activity, and then we want to make that passive, then it's the to plus infinitive part that we make passive. I expect to be told tomorrow. I expect to be told tomorrow means someone will tell me. If I say I expect to tell you tomorrow, that means I will tell someone else. So the key thing here is think about where the action actually happens in the sentence. That's the bit that you need to make passive. And if it just happens to be the to plus infinitive part where the real action is contained, then make that passive by using to, be, and then the past participle. Now, how do we change passive infinitives for tense? Well, usually it's the first verb that changes for tense. So compare the three examples here. I expect to be told today. That's using the present tense here. Although in this case it relates to the future. Sometimes when we have these passive infinitives and passive gerunds, as we'll come to, they're actually used to relate to the future. I expected to be told yesterday. So here, yesterday is in the past. So we use expected, the past simple form. And I had expected to be told last week. This is when we need to use the past perfect. There were probably other bits of the story here where something else had happened after this statement. So we needed to use the past. I won't go into the past perfect rules here. Please watch one of my other videos on the past perfect for that. But there was obviously a grammatical reason here to use the past perfect for the past event. If that's the case, then use the past perfect with the first verb, not the to plus infinitive bit. The to plus infinitive part stays in the passive infinitive form. This is where we have two verbs together, one verb followed by the next. Focus on the first verb for tense. Don't follow normal passive rules where the verb to be changes into was or were or will be. Now, there are some exceptions when it comes to tenses, what we do with passive infinitives. First of all, it is unusual to use the passive infinitive as a continuous form. So I expect to be being told next week. That's not something that we would generally use. It's quite confusing to have be twice in a row. Instead, again for the continuous form, change the verb in the first verb expect into the continuous form. I am expecting to be told next week. Now there's something that breaks this pattern of using the first verb for the tense, and that is if you want to use the future or present perfect. If you want to use the future or present perfect, then use what's called a perfect infinitive instead with the passive form. So look at the first example here. I expect to have been told by next weekend. This is what we say rather than saying, I will have expected to be told. You might think from what I said in the previous parts of the video that you need to change, if you want to use the future perfect in this example, you'd have to change expect into the future perfect, which means I will have expected, and then keep to be told the same. Not here. For the future perfect, instead, change the passive infinitive instead to the perfect passive infinitive. I expect, so we're using the present simple here, to have been told by next weekend. And this is how you form the future perfect with a passive infinitive. Look at the second example now, where we're looking at the present perfect. I expected to have been told by now. Not I have expected to be told. Instead here, change expect into the past simple and then use the passive perfect infinitive have been told. And that is how we create the present perfect if you need to use it for the passive infinitive. So that's passive infinitives, but there are also passive gerunds. For example, I enjoy telling stories. A bit of background to gerunds and infinitives first. Some verbs in English are followed by to plus infinitive when you want to add another verb. And some verbs in English are followed by the gerund form if you want to add another verb. Verbs like enjoy are followed by the verb plus ing. So tell is a verb and telling is the gerund form here. So I enjoy telling stories. So that's the background. That's the basics of the grammar we're using here. We're looking at gerunds in English, but how do we make them passive? The same as what we do with passive infinitives. We keep the first verb at the beginning and then we change the verb to be. And be becomes the gerund form. I enjoy being told stories. Let's explain the meaning of both of these examples here. I enjoy telling stories. Who enjoys telling the stories here? Or should I say, who tells the story? It's the woman. I I tell the story, I enjoy it. But if I say I enjoy being told stories, who tells the story here? It's not I. I here refers to the child. The person telling the story is the father. So it's not the subject. In the first example, I enjoy telling stories. The subject does the action of telling. In the second example, I enjoy being told stories. I receives the action of telling. So the passive gerund is made of the verb to be in the ing form followed by the past participle, and as usual with the passive, it's where the subject receives an action. We use passive gerunds where we would normally use a gerund form in standard English. So, as I mentioned before, after certain verbs such as enjoy, are followed by a gerund if you use another verb. So if you want to make that passive, then you use the gerund of being, being, and then the past participle of the verb. We also use gerunds when we put verbs after prepositions to turn them into nouns. For example here, I am scared of being stung by bees. So the key thing here is the word of. Of is a preposition. So because of, the preposition should be followed by a gerund. When we make it passive, instead of making the verb gerund, instead of saying I'm scared of stinging, for the passive form, again, make be the gerund, being. I am scared of being stung by bees. And then we also use gerunds when we put the verb in the subject position, again, when we're turning them into nouns. So being lost in a forest can be frightening. So we could say it like this. I am lost in a forest, one sentence. This can be frightening, second sentence. But we could turn it into one combined sentence by changing the first sentence into the participle form. So I am lost in a forest. We can convert that into a subject for the sentence by taking the verb, which was to be, making it the subject of the sentence. And if we do that, then we make it the ing form, being. Being lost in a forest can be frightening. One sentence together because we combined the original first sentence and we've made it a subject, and we've done that by changing the verb into the ing form. Now, I received this question as well from another one of my followers. Thank you so much for this question. When and how are present simple and present continuous used to describe past events? This is a really good question. I've covered this in some videos before, but it's a new concept to some people. Doesn't get taught much in English classes, but it really does happen. Sometimes we use the present simple and present continuous to describe past events. Now, I must begin by stressing that usually you should use the past simple and past continuous to describe past events. But having said that, if you search for long enough through texts, corpora, just simple internet searches, it won't be long before you find people using the present simple and present continuous to describe past events. And you'll find that they are native speakers, sometimes writing professionally. So why do they do it? Well, they use the present tenses instead of the past simple or past continuous for certain effects like these. First of all, to help the listener feel they are in the story. So let's focus on this child with their father. So informally, we can say dad. And the child's listening to a story and asks, "What happens next, Dad?" And the dad replies, "Oh, the man is on a desert island. He uses the map to find the treasure." Now, why did he use the present tense here? Surely a story is always about something in the past. It would have been perfectly fine, of course, to say the man was on a desert island and he used the map to find treasure. Past simple, past simple. But he used the present tense instead here to help his child feel that they are in the story. Think of it for a moment. Listen to me telling the story. What happens in your mind? The man is on a desert island. He uses the map to find the treasure. Did you find that me using the present tense encouraged you to actually imagine the situation in your mind, like it's really happening? And that's one of the purposes for using present tenses when we're actually talking about a past story. It encourages us to feel that we are in the story. It encourages us to create images as if this is something really happening. And when you do that, it brings the story to life. Now, another reason is to create a sense of expectation. The story goes on. Does he find the treasure? He runs to the spot. He digs the ground, and there it is. So by using the present tenses here, it creates that sense of expectation by inviting the listener to think that this is really happening now. Listen to me saying it to you. He runs to the spot. He digs the ground, and there it is. Did you find that when I said he runs to the spot, you imagined in your mind running to the spot, and then you're waiting for the next part? Because I've put it into real time, as if it's happening right now, as if he runs in the moment where I'm speaking it. He digs in the moment when I'm speaking it. So it creates that sense of expectation in the listener because I've put the story into real time. And then it's also common to use the present tenses for summaries of a longer story. So the dad finishes the story and then tells his child, in another book, we find out how he escapes the desert island. A quick summary of the whole book. And you'll find that people will do that in book reviews, newspapers, magazines, journals. It's very, very common, even though the story, of course, happened in the past. Now, note we can also use the present continuous for the historical present for the same reasons, but the present continuous adds something even more here. It creates a sense of action and movement in the story, and this adds excitement and suspense to a fast-moving story. Listen again. He's running to the spot. He's digging the ground, and there it is. By using running, I don't just create a picture of a story, I now create a picture of a person in motion. I create a picture of the movement. We imagine the movement. And then I say he's digging. Now we don't just see a person with a spade in their hand. In our minds, we see a person who's actually doing the digging. So it adds something more. It creates this sense of action and movement. Now, I also had a question about using the present continuous for the future. Now, if you look at grammar books or guides, you'll find lots of different explanations about why we use the present continuous for the future, but they all have one thing in common, and it's probably worth mentioning that this is the key thing that holds the present continuous for the future together. And they all focus on the idea of something being arranged. So I've added it here. I'm talking about when we use the present continuous for the future, not other uses of present continuous. Look at the examples here. I'm meeting my manager tomorrow. I've arranged it. We're exploring the city in the morning. Well, you could say it's an intention, but it's still something arranged in someone's plans. And she's climbing the Eiffel Tower when you arrive, perhaps when you arrive at the bottom of the Eiffel Tower. You could say, well, this is just related to a time. This is just putting the present continuous into a time position in the future. But there's still some sort of plan involved here. It has been arranged. It's something that was decided before, that is an arrangement for the future. So I think that's the simplest way to answer the question that I received on the present continuous. If you see grammar books saying, oh, we use the present continuous for the future for this reason, that reason, that reason, actually, they all come back to one thing. The present continuous for the future focuses on arranged. Now, one learner asked me to assess this text for tenses, and they assured me that they wrote it themselves, so I'm going to assess it right now. I'll read it as I go through the different tenses. But before I do, one thing to say, if you did write this yourself, great job. You did really well here. This is an excellent example of a number of tenses and also how we use verbs for participle forms. So we begin with an introduction of present participles, all combined to make one long introduction to a sentence. The first sentence doesn't start, the main part of the first sentence doesn't start until we've got through all of these present participles. After concluding audacious military action in Venezuela, eventually capturing Nicolas Maduro, the Venezuelan president, alongside his wife Cilia Flores, and bringing them to the US to face narco-terrorism and weapons charges, comma, and that's the end of the introductory phrase. That's the end of this participle phrase. But through very clever linking of different parts of this phrase, whoever wrote this has put three different participle phrases together and combined them to make them all related to after. So what's this participle phrase doing? Up to the comma after charges is telling us that actually it means something happened before the main clause, because after is actually related to the main clause where President Trump is. Split into two halves here. The bit with after, with the present participles, means this happened, and then after that, something else happened. After that, President Trump is probably setting his sights on taking over Greenland. So the main clause here is President Trump is probably setting his sights on taking over Greenland. How do we know everything before the comma is not the main clause? Because everything is written in participles, just linked together, concluding, capturing, bringing. They're not proper tenses. So it's rather complex, but if you just look for the first part of the sentence where we have a true subject and a true verb that conjugates for tense, then you find the main clause, and it's actually a long way into the sentence. So let's now focus on this main clause. President Trump is probably setting his sights on taking over Greenland. So this is written in the present continuous, the verb to be, which is in the present simple form. So the verb to be is conjugated for tense here, and setting is the present participle, which we use to make the present continuous. The verb to be followed by the verb with ing. Then we get to the past simple in the next sentence. So find the full stop after military force, and then we'll carry on. The White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, alluded to that when she said that, and I'll stop here for a moment. So here, Caroline Leavitt alluded to that. That means what was said before here. When she said that. So why do we use the past simple here? Because we are referring directly to what Caroline said in the press conference, which is in the past. Then you'll notice that we switch to the present simple. There's a range of options at the Commander-in-Chief's disposal. There's. So apostrophe S, that's the verb is, to be. Present simple. Why do we use the present simple here? Well, notice we have these quotation marks, these two small lines before theirs and two small lines after disposal. And this indicates a quotation. So here we're quoting her exact words that she said at the time. And for that reason, we use the present simple, because that's what she used. Now, why is it theirs and not there are? It's a bit of an odd thing in English grammar. Technically, it should be there are, because a range of options is a plural form. There's, let's even take out a range, even if we just have there are options. English speakers will often use theirs anyway. They'd say there's options at the Commander-in-Chief's disposal. It doesn't look grammatically correct, but it's something about native speech where English speakers often prefer to use theirs even if it's before plural nouns. So it's worth bearing that in mind. If you're writing professionally, I advise you to stick to there are. But if you're speaking, theirs is fairly common. I think I do it in my videos and people have mentioned it in the comments sometimes. Then in the final sentence, we get to the present perfect, meaning Trump hasn't really ruled out using military force to take over a NATO ally. And this means not happened because it's a negative, not happened up to now. So between the past and now, Trump has not done this. Very good text. It's a really good example of some interesting features of tenses. So it was very useful for the video. So thank you very much to the person who wrote this. And then the last request I got earlier today was using inversions with not. That means having not at the beginning of a sentence. Now, to begin with, let's remember why we use inversions. Inversions put emphasis on certain aspects of a sentence by moving them to the front. So in some situations in English, grammatically, it is acceptable to move information from the end of a sentence to the beginning, but then you do something with the grammar where the auxiliary and the subject swap places, which you'll see as I go through. Best if I show you the examples of that. But bear that in mind. The reason why I'm going to show you some examples of inversions with not, and the reason why we use them is to emphasize certain aspects that would otherwise have been at the end of the sentence where they got less emphasis. So first of all, not only, but also. She clearly wants to speak to me. Not only did she phone me, but she also sent a message asking me to call her back. This is probably the most common use of not for inversion. And this emphasizes the only and the also bits. So one thing happened, and then another thing happened, and there's some sense of surprise. She phoned me, but not only did she phone me, but she also did something else, even more than I expected. Notice the grammar here. Not only did she phone me. So here we have did, the auxiliary, before the subject, almost like in question form. We have not at the beginning to bring emphasis to the fact that this was not the only thing that happened. We could have written it another way. She phoned me. This was not the only thing that happened. She also sent me a message. But if I want to emphasize the fact that it's not only, I bring it to the front like this through inversion. Look at the next one as well. Not can be followed by a time phrase, then an auxiliary verb, which is often did but doesn't have to be, and then the subject. Look at the example here. Her message was unclear. Not until later did I understand what she meant. In other words, this second sentence means I didn't understand it until later. But for some reason, the writer wanted to emphasize the fact that it was until later. So they move it to the front and they use not in front of it. Not until later. And then if we use this inversion technique, then we have to include the auxiliary before the subject. We also do this with phrases with since, but remember since is often used with the present perfect. So here the auxiliary is have. The message was lovely. Not since I was a child have I received such a nice message. In other words, I haven't received such a nice message since I was a child. So since I was a child is at the end of the sentence if we say it normally, but someone wants to put more emphasis on that, so they move it to the beginning using inversion with, and they take the negative from haven't, place it at the beginning. So not since I was a child have I received such a nice message. And we can use not to make inversions with all kinds of adverbials. The rules are not limited to a set number of phrases. Here are just a couple of examples. Not in any way did the message change my mind, though. So in other words, the message did not change my mind in any way. I've now moved in any way to the front by using the negative inversion with not. The second one is an example where the auxiliary is not did. Not for any reason am I going to change my mind. In other words, I am not going to change my mind for any reason. Here, the auxiliary is actually am. It helps us to form the present continuous. So instead of did here, keep am as your auxiliary and use not followed by for any reason, and that way you can bring for any reason to the front. Here's a common use of not as an inversion. Not without, and then a noun, then an auxiliary with the subject. So often cats like to chase mice. Perhaps this cat caught the mouse, but then the mouse escaped with a struggle. So not without a struggle did the mouse get free from the cat's claw. So here I'm emphasizing the struggle and the fact that the mouse had to struggle to get free. So it was not without that struggle. In other words, the struggle was important. Well, I hope you've enjoyed that analysis of tenses and inversions with not. I hope you've learned something from it. And thank you very much for sending me your suggestions for the video, because it's really useful sometimes to hear what you want to focus on rather than me coming up with the ideas myself. If I can respond to what you say, sometimes that could be more effective. I hope it's helped you if you put the comments in, and I hope it's helped you if you didn't put the comments in as well. And remember, I've got lots of different ways to help you on my website, englishwithrupert.com. You can book individual appointments with me. I've got PDFs that can help you learn. And I've also got these courses here, which can help you develop your English in a number of different ways. So if you click on the link in the description below this video, englishwithrupert.com/ and then my courses in the way you can see here. Click on the link, it will do it for you, and you can find out more about other ways I can help you with your English.